On August 5th, a piece of SpaceX rocket debris spun out of control and slammed into the lunar surface at 8,700 kilometers per hour. The force of the impact was equivalent to detonating nearly 3 tons of TNT. SpaceX officials were quick to clarify that the collision was unintended, explaining that a volatile mix of gravitational pulls and solar radiation had nudged the rocket off course and directly into the moon. When the news first broke, it was widely written off as just another routine piece of space junk. This 4-ton metal hulk, roughly the size of a city bus, was the spent upper stage of a Falcon 9 rocket launched back in 2025. It had been drifting aimlessly through the void for months, untracked, unclaimed, and completely ignored by both governments and corporations, until it silently plowed into the surface right next to the Einstein crater, far too fast for anyone to see it coming. NASA officials immediately issued a calming statement. Earth was in no danger, adding that meteorites packing similar kinetic energy strike the moon roughly once every 6 days anyway. But that reassuring statement glossed over the true gravity of the situation. Because this was never about Earth's immediate safety, it was about the fact that human hands had just carved an uncontrolled scar into a lunar surface that had remained virtually untouched for over 50 years. The crash blasted open a crater anywhere between 18 and 30 meters wide, showering dust and rock fragments across a massive radius. An observatory in Chile captured a plume expanding dozens of kilometers into space. Scientists even detected traces of vaporized sodium and lithium in the sky. It was as if the moon itself briefly flared up from the blow. This wasn't a mere accident. It was the exact second half a century of silence shattered. Ever since humanity pulled back from the moon with Apollo 17 in 1972, the satellite had sat like an untouched museum locked in time. No new footprints, no fresh impacts, zero human intervention. The moon was the last pristine frontier in our reach, until a stray piece of rocket debris, moving at 8,700 kilometers per hour, obliterated that untouchability in a fraction of a second. SpaceX's defense of an unintentional anomaly sounds reasonable enough. Gravity, solar winds, and unpredictable orbital drift, all technically accurate. But this crash stands as the first undeniable proof of humanity's growing carelessness in space. Hundreds of tons of derelict space junk are currently circling above us, and sooner or later, more of it will rain down in the exact same way. What passes today as a victimless accident could easily trigger an international crisis tomorrow, with superpowers pointing fingers at one another. For scientists, it was an unexpected windfall. Observing in real time how a hypervelocity impact reshapes the lunar crust provided data no Earth-bound lab could ever replicate. But for the general public, the picture was far more unsettling. That pristine white disk in the night sky was no longer untouchable. It was now a target board scarred by human error. And in reality, this crash was merely the tip of a massive iceberg. A much larger, far more ruthless story was already unfolding around the moon. This small collision was just the first piece of shrapnel. The myth of the moon landing has always been sold using the same heroic trope: brave astronauts, waving flags, and cheering crowds. But beneath that polished narrative lies a graveyard that was systematically buried for decades. January 27th, 1967. The Apollo 1 crew was strapped inside their capsule during a routine launchpad test. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen. It took only a single spark. Within seconds, an inferno consumed the interior. The pad crew rushed to get them out, but the internal pressure had surged so violently that the hatch was pinned shut for 90 agonizing seconds. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee burned to death before their rocket ever cleared the pad. On the Soviet side, the disasters were buried under an even deeper blanket of state secrecy. In 1961, cosmonaut Valentin Bondarenko perished in a fire inside a high-oxygen training chamber. His death was completely erased from history for years. The public didn't even know his name. It only surfaced in Soviet archives 2 decades later. 6 years after that, Vladimir Komarov's Soyuz 1 capsule re-entered Earth's atmosphere. But the main parachute failed to deploy. The capsule slammed into the ground at 200 kilometers per hour. Komarov became the first human casualty of an in-flight space mission. Reports later revealed that engineers were fully aware of the lethal design flaws prior to launch, but political pressure made backing down impossible. Komarov's close friends would later confide that before strapping in, he knew he wasn't coming back alive. By 1971, tragedy struck a third time. The Soyuz 11 crew was returning to Earth after a record-breaking 23-day stay aboard their space station. During descent, a pressure equalization valve popped open prematurely. The cabin's atmosphere vented into the void in under 60 seconds. The crew wasn't wearing pressure suits. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev became the first and only humans to die in the actual vacuum of space. You wouldn't have found these names in the headlines back then. The Soviet press operated under strict state censorship to bury any hint of failure. In America, while the Apollo 1 disaster was made public, it was swiftly reframed as the unavoidable cost of progress. Not even a congressional investigation was allowed to slow the program down. Both superpowers concealed the exact same truth in their own way. Reaching the moon was infinitely more lethal than anyone dared to admit. While victory photos were being printed, these men were quietly left to rust in the archives. Space was marketed as a romantic frontier of human exploration. In reality, it was an unforgiving vacuum engineered to kill the human body. Pressure, temperature, oxygen, everything hung on a razor-thin margin of error measured in millimeters. The slightest deviation meant agonizing death in minutes. A single loose bolt was enough. A blown seal was enough. A stray spark was all it took to rewrite history. The space race was never purely about discovery. It was a dick measuring contest funded for national pride. And the ones who paid the ultimate price were the men stuffed inside those cramped metal coffins. Yet these deaths didn't scare America or the Soviets away from the moon. If anything, they stepped on the gas. But why? After winning a race bought with human blood, did humanity suddenly walk away and leave the moon completely behind? December 11th, 1972. Apollo 17 touched down on the lunar surface, the last crewed mission to do so. Nobody standing in mission control that day claimed it would be the end. Yet over half a century has passed, and not a single human has set foot there since. In popular culture, people love to blame this sudden silence on wild conspiracy theories. Was the landing staged? Did we stumble onto some hidden alien threat? Did something scare us off? The truth is far more mundane and far more cold-blooded. The money ran out. Between the 1960s and 70s, the Apollo program burned through roughly $25 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $250 billion today. At its peak in 1966, NASA was devouring nearly 5% of the entire US federal budget. That is a level of peacetime government spending unmatched in modern history. The moment Neil Armstrong took his famous step, the political calculus shifted overnight. Kennedy's pledge to reach the moon before this decade is out was checked off. America had beaten the Soviets, and nobody in Washington wanted to keep pouring billions into a race that was already won. On top of that, the financial drain of the Vietnam War was spiraling, and the US economy was sliding into stagflation. In the eyes of Congress, there was zero political dividend in landing on the moon a second, third, or fourth time. Even television ratings collapsed after the second landing. Not even the near-fatal drama of Apollo 13 could reignite public interest. And so, the line items were quietly crossed off the budget. Apollo 20 was butchered first. Its massive Saturn V rocket was cannibalized to lift the Skylab space station. Soon after, Apollo 18 and 19 were sent to the chopping block. These weren't just cancelled flight plans. They were abandoning fully built, flight-ready Saturn V rockets that had cost billions to manufacture. The most powerful machines ever built were left to sit on the tarmac and rust. Today, those rockets sit sideways in museum hangars like giant, dusty monuments to a cancelled future. This was the unglamorous reality of humanity's escape from the moon. Not aliens, not cosmic horrors, just a line item on a ledger. Once the geopolitical dick measuring was over, the motivation vanished. And once the motivation vanished, the bill became indefensible. Years later, even top NASA administrators admitted the withdrawal wasn't a choice. It was an economic surrender. Washington redirected its cash toward a cheaper, safer alternative in low Earth orbit, the Space Shuttle program. The moon was dead weight. For 50 years, we didn't go back because there was no political penalty for staying home, while the price tag of returning was astronomical. It was like disbanding a winning army after the war ended. Nobody wanted to pay for the draft anymore. But now, right in the middle of that decades-long silence, a piece of rogue metal has slammed into the lunar soil. And it reminded the world that running away didn't solve the problem, because the moment we decide to go back, we are going to crash headfirst into an unresolved, lethal physics problem. It's 2026. We are conversing with advanced AI, and surgeons are performing heart transplants using robotics. Yet SpaceX's state-of-the-art rocket is still blowing up in mid-air. Just look at the recent test flights. Multiple Starship prototypes have disintegrated into fiery clouds just minutes after clearing the pad, showering debris over the Caribbean and into the ocean. Elon Musk routinely brushes these failures off with the corporate euphemism rapid, unscheduled disassembly. It sounds witty on X, but it masks a terrifying truth. Even our most cutting edge rocket tech is still wildly prone to catastrophic failure. The FAA has been forced to ground Starship multiple times this year alone, keeping the mega rocket tethered to the Earth while federal investigations dragged on. The playbook never changes. The rocket lifts off, climbs for a few glorious minutes, turns into a multi-billion-dollar fireball. Engineers bury their heads in telemetry data, patch a minor flaw, and an entirely new point of failure detonates the next attempt. This isn't systemic incompetence, it's a brutal, unforgiving exam administered by nature. We are attempting to tame the most complex machines in human history. The obstacle isn't bad engineering, the obstacle is physics itself. Look at a rocket sitting on a pad. Roughly 90% of its total mass is pure, unadulterated explosive fuel. The remaining 10% is everything else: the engines, the hull, the avionics, and whatever tiny payload it's carrying. A rocket isn't a vehicle, it's a giant flying bomb with a thin steering capsule strapped to the tip. That ratio isn't an arbitrary choice. It's an unyielding mathematical law known as the tyranny of the rocket equation. To gain more velocity, you need more fuel. But that extra fuel adds more weight, which in turn demands even more fuel just to lift it. There is no cheating this math. Because of this, rockets cannot be over-engineered like cars or airplanes. Every single gram must be shaved off. The metal walls are engineered paper-thin, and propellant tanks are pressurized right up against their absolute structural limits. A microscopic weld defect leads to immediate detonation. A hairline fracture in a seal is a death sentence. A valve sticking open for a millisecond ends the mission. Punching through Earth's atmosphere is a nightmare of its own. As a rocket accelerates to thousands of meters per second, it is locked in a violent tug-of-war against both gravity and atmospheric drag. The engines run at maximum thermal capacity, with internal temperatures approaching the melting point of titanium. If a single component overheats by a few degrees, the result is instant: a fireball over the Atlantic. The physics governing spaceflight haven't softened an inch in 50 years. Rockets explode because nature doesn't give discounts. And yet, while this lethal equation remains fundamentally unsolved, the world's two largest superpowers are already drawing up property lines on the moon. Earth is no longer big enough for our wars. The new front line has been drawn at the moon's south pole. In April 2026, NASA astronauts orbited the moon aboard Artemis 2, marking the first time humans traveled beyond low Earth orbit in over half a century. But that was just a dress rehearsal. The real show begins in 2028, when the Artemis 4 crew is slated to land directly on the lunar south pole for a week-long stay. NASA's playbook is clear: turn this landing into the anchor point for a permanent human base. Artemis 5 will follow a year later, kickstarting an era of annual surface missions. But Washington isn't the only player on the field. China and Russia are moving at breakneck speed to plant their own flags in the exact same territory. The two nations have forged a massive alliance called the International Lunar Research Station, the largest geopolitical space bloc since the Cold War. Their goal? Establish a fully operational lunar base by 2035. Even more aggressive, they've already signed a binding agreement to construct a surface nuclear reactor to power it. Over 13 non-aligned nations have signed on. This is no longer a science race between two agencies. It's a cold war between two massive global blocs. So why is every superpower clawing over the exact same patch of lunar dirt? The secret lies in the shadows. The moon's south pole is pockmarked with deep, pitch-black craters that haven't seen a ray of sunlight in billions of years. Locked inside these freezing abysses are vast deposits of water ice. That means drinking water, oxygen, and when split apart, liquid hydrogen for rocket propellant. Meanwhile, the high ridges surrounding these craters enjoy near-perpetual sunlight, offering endless solar power. The South Pole is simultaneously a gold mine, a power plant, and the ultimate gas station for future deep space missions to Mars, which is precisely why the land grab has already started. Nobody is outright declaring, "This is our sovereign land." That would break international law. Instead, both sides are maneuvering their landing zones right next to the most resource-rich craters and sunlight peaks. The strategy is primitive: squat on the prime real estate first and force the latecomers to play by your rules. Geopolitical rivalry on Earth is spawning a brand new concept of borders on the moon: uncharted, unmapped, but effectively militarized territory. This isn't about scientific curiosity anymore. Whoever controls the water and power on the moon first will dictate the terms of the trillion-dollar space economy. The old feuds of Earth have officially been exported 384,000 kilometers into the void. But there's a far dirtier motive behind this sudden urgency that nobody in power wants to talk about. The sudden sprint back to the moon isn't driven by scientific wonder, it's driven by cold, hard cash. A multi-trillion-dollar treasure chest hanging directly above our heads. For 50 years, the public was fed the narrative that the moon was a dead, useless rock. That was a lie. Baked into the top layer of lunar soil is an element accumulated over 4 billion years of solar bombardment, helium-3. On Earth, this isotope is practically non-existent. Total global reserves amount to just a few hundred kilograms. On the moon, without an atmosphere to block the solar wind, it has saturated the regolith. Scientists estimate there are at least 1 million tons of helium-3 sitting right on the surface. Why does that number matter? Because helium-3 is the holy grail for next-generation nuclear fusion reactors. It provides virtually unlimited, zero radioactive waste energy. At current market projections, a single ton of helium-3 could be worth up to $5 billion. Do the math. A million tons equals a multi-trillion-dollar market. No oil field, no gold mine on Earth comes close to that scale of wealth. A single shuttle load could power an entire industrialized nation for a year, and helium-3 is just the headline. The water ice buried in the southern craters represents billions in saved launch costs for orbital fuel depots. Vast deposits of rare earth elements and platinum group metals, the essential building blocks for modern electronics that are rapidly depleting on Earth, have also been detected. The moon isn't a desert, it's an untapped bank vault. While Earth's richest veins have been stripped clean over centuries, the moon's reserves haven't felt a single pickaxe. That's why governments and private conglomerates suddenly lost their patience. The noble rhetoric about expanding human horizons is a PR mask hiding a corporate land grab. The race is on. Who builds the extraction tech first? Who patents the refining process first? Who ships the first payload back to Earth? Startups are already pitching lunar mining rigs. Patents are piling up, and venture capital is pouring billions into the hype. Companies are reaching multi-billion-dollar market caps without having extracted a single grain of dirt. They are chasing craters the exact same way 19th century tycoons chased oil wells. Except this time, the oil well is 384,000 kilometers away. The moon is no longer a poetic silver disk in the sky, it is the planet's next great plunder. And whenever a treasure this massive is left unguarded, history teaches us a brutal rule. Where there are no laws, the fastest gun makes the rules. In 1967, the international community declared space a global commons, a realm that no single nation could ever claim. 59 years later, that landmark treaty isn't worth the paper it's printed on. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was explicit. No celestial body, including the moon, is subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty. On paper, it was a utopian triumph. But the diplomats who drafted it made one fatal oversight. They never envisioned a world where private billionaires would become richer, faster, and far less risk-averse than sovereign nation-states. Back then, space was the exclusive playground of empires. The idea of a private corporation rivaling a superpower was science fiction. And that oversight left a massive legal loophole. The treaty bans claiming the land, but says absolutely nothing about extracting and selling the resources inside the land. Legal scholars call it the catch the fish doctrine. Nobody owns the ocean, but the moment you haul a tuna onto your deck, that fish is 100% your private property to sell. Washington exploited this loophole first, passing domestic legislation that granted US citizens the right to commercially own space resources. Dozens of nations quickly followed suit. The new global doctrine became clear. You can't own the moon, but you can dig it up, process it, and sell it to the highest bidder. This is where nation-states surrendered the driver's seat to private oligarchs. SpaceX already holds the multi-billion-dollar contract for NASA's lunar lander. Blue Origin sued NASA over that exact contract, successfully paralyzing the timeline for months. These corporations are no longer mere contractors, they are the de facto architects of humanity's future on the moon. Elon Musk's Mars obsession and Jeff Bezos's orbital industrial visions hold far more sway over space policy than Congress or the UN. NASA literally cannot set foot on the moon without relying on private rockets, a power dynamic that would have horrified 1960s policymakers. We are witnessing the rebirth of a historical nightmare, corporate feudalism. In the 17th century, the Dutch and British East India companies ruled vast continents, waging private wars, minting their own currencies, and writing their own laws, all while flying behind state flags. Today, the exact same model is being deployed in orbit. Whoever builds the first permanent lunar base will dictate the de facto laws of that territory. And who is building those bases? Not democratic governments, but unaccountable billionaires whom nobody elected, nobody approved, and nobody can regulate. The legal vacuum on the moon remains wide open. No oversight body exists, no property boundaries are enforced. But the modern barons are already on the ground and they are already digging. That 4-ton slab of metal that slammed into the lunar surface on August 5th wasn't just space junk, it was the opening salvo for a brand new era. For 50 years, the moon was the last pristine mirror reflecting human ambition. We admired it from afar. It inspired poets, lit up our nights, and stood as an untouchable sanctuary. When that rocket debris hit the Einstein crater at 2.4 kilometers per second, that era died. We are no longer passive observers. We are polluting, detonating, and industrializing the sky. The contamination has already begun. Hundreds of tons of dead satellites and booster stages are orbiting above us like a ring of trash. Every piece is a ticking time bomb, a catalyst for the next cascade of orbital collisions. Scientists catalog the debris, but the list grows longer every month. Nobody cleans it up. Nobody pays for the damage. Nobody is held accountable. Meanwhile, multi-billion-dollar rockets continue to explode in mid-air. The tyranny of the rocket equation remains unbroken, and every launch remains a high-stakes gamble. And now comes the division. The US and the Sino-Russian alliance are carving up the exact same craters, fighting over the exact same ice, while private billionaires exploit a 60-year-old legal loophole to build private fiefdoms in space. None of this is happening by accident. It all stems from the exact same human flaw. The same flaw that burned the crew of Apollo 1 alive. The same flaw that doomed Komarov when his chute failed. The same flaw that suffocated the men of Soyuz 11 in the cold dark. Our unyielding willingness to sacrifice human life for national dominance. Our instinct to hoard every scrap of power. Our refusal to share. We spent centuries terrorizing Earth with this behavior, and now we are exporting it 384,000 kilometers into space. Perhaps the ultimate irony is this. The budget ledgers that forced us to abandon the moon 50 years ago are the exact same reason we are charging back today. Back then, we ran away when the money dried up. Today, we are charging back because there are trillions to be made. The motivation never shifted. Only the sign on the balance sheet flipped. We aren't going back out of wonder. We aren't going back for science. We are going back for profit. So this story was never really about the moon. It was always about us. Every time humanity reaches a new horizon, we repeat the exact same tragic cycle. First, we marvel at it. Then, we strip mine it. Then, we fight over who owns it. We overfish the oceans. We clear-cut the forests. We drilled the poles. Now, it's the turn of the last untouched rock in the night sky. That impact on August 5th happened in total, soundless vacuum. But the message it sent back to Earth was deafening. There is no turning back. The moon is no longer a distant sacred observer. It is a front line, a strip mine, a real estate war. It is the next piece of territory humanity will pollute, exploit, and carve up. And without changing a single thing about our broken nature on Earth, we are taking those exact same habits with us to the stars.